Welcome to Windows on the World, bringing you cutting-edge news, empowering information, and no conspiracy theories. Well, Kevin and Annett, welcome back to Windows on the World.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Appreciate it.
Well, it's always a pleasure to hear what you've been up to and what's going on with the ITCCS. And you have even more revelations, and you've set up a couple more of these common law courts. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, there's two new groups that have affiliated to ITCCS. There's a new common law group in New Zealand that's in the process of setting up. They're working with the Maori people to set up common law courts to basically help the Maori get their land back and to fight corruption in the government. In Holland, there's a thing called the Dutch People's Tribunal that was formed by ITCCS members there, including some of the people who have given testimony about the child trafficking going on, involving the Dutch royal family, the murder of children in these hunting parties and that. The people who are involved in exposing that have set up this People's Tribunal. They've already issued summonses against the Prime Minister of Holland, Mark Rutte, who has been accused by other people, including the former Member of Parliament, Laurent Louis, as being involved in this, active member of this child trafficking. So this is very encouraging. There's other groups that are, getting actively involved in naming the criminals in church and state that are involved in these things. As
far as the accuracy of the information, how are you actually vetting this at the moment?
Well, there's actually the evidence from the two courts that we've already convened, one having to do with genocide in Canada. All of that evidence has been posted for a while. All of the links to the 150 exhibits we used to bring a guilty verdict against Joseph Ratzinger, the Queen of England, others who were found guilty of genocide in Canada and concealing it. All of that's been up online for a while. The recent evidence involving the present Pope Francis, the head of the Jesuits, the head of the Church of England, Justin Welby, that's all being selectively vetted because it's part of an ongoing investigation, and it was felt that we didn't want to put the witnesses and the other people involved in bringing this evidence out at risk right now. Although we have begun to share some of the evidence, for example, the testimonies up at itccs.org from Anne-Marie van Billenberg, who is one of these lawyers who had firsthand knowledge of how children were being taken out of the youth detention centers and used in the forests outside Brussels in these human hunting parties involving these elites. And that was up a few months ago at itccs.org. So there is information selectively being released, but we expect more to be coming out definitely by the spring, when there's going to be, like I say, these new courts convening in Europe.
I've looked at both of those websites, and it is interesting. You're getting these different people on board. The New Zealand one says it's the New Zealand Common Law Society. Is this a new thing that's been set up?
Yeah, there hasn't been anything like that before. Like that in common law countries like England, New Zealand, Canada, we've really had a big dose of historic amnesia. We've forgotten the roots of the law in England especially, arose out of the belief that the sovereigns were not the king, they weren't the Pope, it was the people in Parliament. The Commons was considered the source of all authority and law in England. Well, that whole idea was kind of gotten rid of after the royalty was restored after the Republic in the 1649 to 1660.
Yes.
Definitely an attempt to get rid of that knowledge, and so we're really reviving what's been here for a long time.
Well, that's what really fascinates me about it, because a lot of this really comes back to taking our own sovereignty back, and that's what I felt has been the heart of it from the start with me. looking into this, because when people are in their own power and standing in truth, then basically lies become exposed, and we're living in a society now where lies are becoming the norm. Every public official is trained to lie. So I mean, your work is great, and I know that you've had ups and downs with it. You've had a bit of infiltration here and there, and you're still carrying on. So can you tell us a bit about this this new finding that the 12-mile club?
Yeah, well, it goes back to what you just said. As people stand in their sovereignty and truth, it brings that out in other people too, including people within the system, police, politicians, others who want to do the right thing. Now, recently, we've had a number of insiders come forward to give us really startling new evidence of the involvement of really high-level government and church people in these crimes. I'll start with the one you mentioned, the most recent posting on November 8th at itccs.org, which people can read. It has to do with this disclosure of something we knew about for a while, called the 12-mile club on the west coast of Canada. Now, 12-mile refers to the territorial limit, which is Canadian waters. Outside of that, it's international waters. Basically, what these rich guys do in Vancouver is they kidnap children, often off Indian reservations and out of, foster care homes, and, the usual place they get kids. They take them out, they, molest them, they do whatever they want with them, and then they kill them and dump them overboard outside the 12-mile limit. This is attested to by a number of people. It was first described in 1994 by a trial lawyer called Jack Cram, who exposed it. He even named the judges involved, and they responded by locking him up. He was arrested in the courtroom by sheriffs. They put him away in a psych institute for a couple of weeks, and they got rid of all his evidence. They ransacked his office, and then they disbarred the guy. But the knowledge continued, and now there's actual insiders of this group that are coming forward. And that followed on a story that came out on November 4th, which is also posted at itccs.org, an even bigger story having to do with in the Harper government, Stephen Harper's Conservative government in Canada, his senior cabinet minister, a guy called Denis Lebel, who's really important. He's a senior Quebec cabinet minister who figures really prominently in the coming election. He was named as having taken part in a Ninth Circle ritual killing in Rome on February 22nd, and we posted all the newspaper clippings about this. Denis Lebel headed a government delegation to go see this guy, a Quebec archbishop called Gerald Lacroix, who was made a cardinal by Pope Francis on February 22nd. According to witnesses, that same night at midnight, the two men were involved in this Ninth Circle ritual at a place called the San Lorenzo Church, which is right across from the Jesuit headquarters, just about half a mile from the Vatican. Now, whether or not Denis Lebel was lured there and is now being manipulated and blackmailed, which they often do in these settings as a way to control politicians and judges and others, or whether he was an active member of the Ninth Circle, we're still trying to discover. But it definitely is responsible, we believe, for these recent false flag events in Canada, where there was a soldier shot on Parliament Hill. The very week this news was beginning to come out. So we think that, those two things are related.
You're kind of focusing here on something that obviously has been reported worldwide, and to actually narrow it down like this, obviously you're becoming more of a target now, and we talked about this before, but are you experiencing any more problems than you were 5 years ago?
Levels. First of all, the level of internet harassment smear is really being ramped up again, and that's understandable. It's because we're not just talking in general about these crimes, which a lot of people do. We're naming names, we're giving addresses, we're giving dates, and when you get that specific, obviously they get worried. That's why 4 top church officials have all resigned after being named in our indictments. Not only Pope Benedict, but Cardinal Teo Bertoni, the head of the Jesuits, Adolfo Pichon, and the Cardinal in Ireland, Brady. All of them stepped down because we are naming them specifically as part of these crimes. So the harassment has continued just to try to confuse people, the distraction, the attacks on us. But also there have been actual physical attempts on the lives of people in Europe and other places. We've had to increase the security. one of the top researchers for the ITCCS in Belgium just vanished 2 months ago. We don't know where he is. So, I mean, when you're naming Drangheta, the mafia criminal syndicate that's fighting the children in these cult rituals, and their long history with the Catholic Church, obviously you're beginning to step on bigger toes now.
Yeah, sorry, Kevin, you were just cracking up there a little bit. You meant Drangheta, is it called?
Yes.
Yes.
Drangheta. It's the name. Yeah, Drangheta is the name for the modern mafia, the one that do a lot of the drug trafficking, money laundering, human trafficking in Europe especially.
As you just said, there's a lot of people generalizing and pointing their fingers vaguely, and that's very easy to do. But obviously, as we know, in the law system, you have to be specific and give proper evidence. And this is where I find what you're doing very, very fascinating. You're getting these people from all over the world helping. Surely they're organized enough to now be aware of that. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that you can't really stop this process once the lid is off. And that's why, frankly, these guys have been doing increasingly desperate measures. When you start threatening to kill people, that means their backs are to the wall. In a way, that's a good sign. But it's also to cover up, this broader stuff, which we can talk about, which has to do with the Vatican financial dealings, how they're funding a lot of the BRIC nations. And this new investment bank set up in Asia as a rival to the World Bank, that's got a lot of Vatican Bank money in it that was put in it through the Deutsche Bank in Germany. So, that's kind of the bigger, when you're following the money, you realize these guys really don't want their little financial deals exposed, and that's what part of their concern is,
That's really what it's about. We're talking about business here. It's interesting because when people think about the Vatican, they often think of it as a religious organization, which it isn't really, because this is something you were talking about years ago, that basically the Vatican is a bank. It's a financial structure, and it preys on people through this idea of original sin, which was a complete invention. And that's how the whole court system came about, and the whole looting operation of the human race, really.
Well, exactly. And the thing to understand, like, to give a simple statistic, in the United States, in the year 2013, the cash pulled in $170 billion, only 0.5% to charity. So the 9.5% of the money brought in was actually used in corporate undertakings, money laundering, all that stuff. It doesn't really, that religious stuff is the thin veneer that they use to fool people with.
Yeah, I think that's becoming more and more obvious, and that veneer is getting thinner and thinner. We're going to take a short break, and we'll see you in a couple of minutes. Okay, Kevin and Annett, welcome back to Windows on the World.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you on. And we talk a lot about these revelations that are happening at quite a frightening rate, really, in a way. There's more and more being exposed, and you're recruiting people. All over the world, people are getting involved in this now, which I think is brilliant because you've been at it such a long time. And the background of this really is something that I'd like to talk about. in the respect of what the Vatican is and how that links in with other religious institutions. For instance, when we talked a couple of years ago, we did an interview and you talked about the United Church in Canada, and basically that was under the Holy Roman See. Now, a lot of
Right.
people, they think that the Church of England and Protestant churches are different, but really they're part of the same organization. Could you explain that a bit to people?
Right. Well, what is often called Protestant churches are not really separate from Rome as long as they're affiliated in some way to the Crown of England. Because the Crown of England itself, as we know, financially and even legally, is still considered a wing of the Church of Rome. And, that started back in 1213, the Treaty of Verona, where King John, who signed Magna Carta, actually was a vassal of the Pope. Yeah, he needed money and he had to become a vassal. So all of England was put under papal jurisdiction. So that explains why in my ordination certificate, when I became a United Church of Canada minister, it said we're part of the Holy Catholic Church, right on my ordination certificate, which I took great offense at. But they didn't understand that because the United Church was set up by an act of Parliament, it's part of the Crown of England and hence part of the Church of Rome. If you're a free church, independent like a Congregationalist or a Baptist or something, that's not the case. But if you're tied into the Church of England at all and the Crown of England, definitely you're tied to Rome.
Yes, and this is a thing that a lot of people don't get. And when I started looking into it, I found that, for instance, during the time of Henry VIII, which was meant to be the Reformation, that the Vatican appeared to be taking more and more control. And Henry seemed to be advised by these Venetian magouars and bankers. And a lot of historians I've spoken to say, well, yeah, what you're saying makes sense here because that's something that they couldn't understand. So at the time of the Protestant Reformation, Britain became Catholic.
Right. Well, that's even the title that the every monarch has, Defender of the Faith. That was a title bestowed on Henry VIII by the Pope, because Henry wrote a tract condemning Martin Luther, and Henry became split off from Rome for his own political reasons, and basically to grab the land of the church, which comprised about a third of all of England, was in the hands of the Catholic Church. He did it for that reason, but he never gave up the papal idea of, well, like Romanism, of, that there had to be this figure telling everybody what to believe. And so you're right, it didn't really break from Rome at all. And that's why now the Church of England, the Anglican Church, is talking about going back into the fold, going back into the Roman Catholic Church. That's why Pope Benedict was meeting with the Queen in 2010 up at Balmoral Castle in Edinburgh to arrange that. And that's, the very fact that she's doing that is a violation of her coronation oath and really is grounds for abdication right there.
Oh, yes, they're absolutely correct. I mean, looking at that time period again, though, the time of Henry VIII, when the poor laws were massively extended and we all became paupers. For instance, the later what became the Births, Deaths and Registrations Act of 1666, which I call the burning of the paupers, which was made way for the new city of, the new city of Troy, the Templar city. It's very interesting that the poor laws were advanced so heavily during the time of Henry VIII, and also there was the certificate of settlement, which meant that you had to carry this thing, which later became the passport. And if you were found to be in error, then the parish could basically look after you, and you'd be put in the poorhouse as a slave. And the update of that is the passport. So if you've got a British or colonial passport, it will actually have passport type P, and the P stands for pauper. And all this stuff is deeply occult and hidden in plain sight, and people don't get that. Now, it's this control that the Roman Church have over people's everyday lives, which is frightening.
That's right, and it's all tied into why there's so much child abuse, child trafficking. It's institutionalized because psychologically that's the way you control people. You not only traumatize them at a young age, you tell them that basically there's nothing wrong with traumatizing children and hurting them. That's why it's still not a crime in papal law to rape a child. It's part of their control, and families going around in a state of fear because of what might happen to them. And that's what they need, a pauperized population, like you say, needs to be in that mental state.
This kind of blackmailing thing is the update of basically sacrificing the children to Moloch. I think it was 1 in every 60 children had to be sacrificed to Moloch,
Right.
and which basically means burned alive. And that brings me to another thing I was going to talk to you about. I was recently looking at Anne Askew, the Protestant martyr. She's known as a martyr. She was landed gentry in Britain and was burnt at the stake in Smithfield in 1546 during the time of Henry VIII.
Mm-hmm.
And she was burned for denying that the Eucharist was the real flesh and blood of Christ. In other
Right.
words, she was saying this is a pagan thing and it's not
Yeah.
a Christian thing. And I find that extremely puzzling that she was burned at the stake for that. Have you got any ideas why that might be? And is it possible that there could have been some Jesuit involvement in that?
Definitely, because that was their method of operation. Anyone who challenged any part of Catholic dogma was instantly burned at that time. There's a long way. It didn't just happen under Bloody Mary, Henry's daughter, who tried to reinstitute Catholicism in England. It was happening under Queen Elizabeth as well. It's all, like I say, a form of neo-papism. Okay, the Pope isn't the head of the church, the Queen is now, but it's basically the same system. There can be no dissent. That happened to my own family too. My ancestor Peter Annett was put in the stocks in London in 1761 because he simply challenged whether parts of the Old Testament were true or not, and they had locked him away for even writing a pamphlet about that. So, it's that long tradition, and it's really still at work, just more subtly.
That's right. It's in the background, and we see it. I think what your point about that compromise is extremely important because it's used so much. I don't think there's a public figure who's put on that world stage now who is not compromised.
Yeah, that's how they control people. That's the Canadian minister, cabinet minister, who was taken to the Drangheta cult ritual back in February. They were using that as a way to blackmail and control the Canadian government. They do the same all over Europe. So, when these figures show up at these cult rituals, it's part of that blackmailing, but also shows you how extensive among the elites these crimes really are.
It really does. And this is where I think focusing this thing about this satanic element and this people, there's a big generalization about it, but in actual fact, it's part of the Roman cult. It always has been. The sacrifice of children and the traumatization of children. It's basically, we're talking about stealing energy and stealing life, and we know that the Vatican inter bones everywhere they can, which is we're talking about a very pagan thing here because on the high end of it, they still want to control people's souls even after they're dead.
That's right. That's exactly right. And as a matter of fact, that case we talked about previously, where this Canadian cabinet minister, Denis Labelle, was taken to a Ninth Circle young boy on February 22nd of this year. That date, February 21st and 22nd, were this festival of, it was called Feria and Terminalia. And basically what happened on those dates in ancient Rome was animals and children were taken and publicly sacrificed to honor the ancient ancestors. Well, they keep practicing these Roman rituals thousands of years later. It's part of that cultic system that's still in place.
It certainly is. And if we go to the Guildhall in London, very highly Freemasonic place, underneath the Guildhall, they announced that they'd found a Roman amphitheatre. Well, they must have known it was there when they built it, over the top of the, and they do seem to preserve these things. And what I've noticed about, we're doing some research into Smithfield is that on the site of the gallows in Smithfield, we've looked at this very carefully from old maps, and we did a video on it, or secret ritual slaughter in Smithfield, and the haberdashers' hall, the Freemasonic haberdashers' hall, is their courtroom, which is their womb with their oval, is over the top of where those gallows were.
Right.
And they seem to use these places where trauma has taken place, and they seem to be still using the energy. It's a very interesting area, that Smithfield, especially from the perspective of the sacrifices that went on, especially during the time of Henry VIII and the Anaskew, her burning there, but she was burned at the stake. But that whole area is barbaric ritual sacrifice. Even St. Bartholomew's Church, of course, where Wat Tyler ran in,
Right.
when he got basically after the peasants' revolt, people came up to London, and of course he was accused of lunging at the mayor of London, and he was mortally wounded, ran into St. Bartholomew's Church and finished off within the church where he went for sanctuary. But there seems to be this element, when you look into it, that these sites are used because of what's happened there. And it's absolutely fantastic that it's been brought to the attention in a way, in the respect of the popularity of this barbaric cult basically is diminishing.
It's especially the case in Rome. The Vatican is built on the site of Caligula's palace, and of course Caligula, one of the most sadistic emperors. I mean, they all were, but he especially. That's where the Pope lives, right on that land. And St. Peter's Square is built from the columns taken right from the Colosseum. I mean, where people were slaughtered for centuries. I mean, it's all of that energy, and you can feel it when you're there, definitely.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing that there is something very tangible about those sort of places. There is still an atmosphere that you can pick up if you actually still yourself and basically take in the energy of these places. And it's a mixture of kind of sorrow and despair, and these people are feeding off that. What do you think about the idea that these archons, these sort of entities, are feeding off? Because I was in Westminster Cathedral, where we actually met. I think we met outside there in 2010, and we did a short interview.
Yeah.
Went into there, and I was quite disturbed by the energies in there, and of course the symbolism. But I saw people praying in there, and they, to me, looked as though they were being possessed. There's nothing good about this Roman cult at all, because it controls us through the law system, the corrupt courts. People are basically having everything taken off them through this Roman cult. Where do you think this really originated? Have you got any ideas on that?
Well, I mean, definitely the most immediate link, of course, is right back to Rome. But before that, it goes much, it's older in the ancient Near Eastern world, and a system of child sacrifice. Moloch and Baal, definitely, the whole society was organized around child sacrifice and murder. Those same symbols are still used regularly in papal processions. There's been a lot posted on the internet about that, close-up pictures of what the popes wear. Those are quite often ancient Near Eastern symbols. And it's all cultic, and people have written about this. But I find too that when you're talking about the energy in these places, it's fear-based. So it's very odd psychologically how people can feel comfortable even though they're in a climate of fear, because they're basically told, if you play the game, you'll be protected, right? But if you wander off at all, you'll be harmed. And it's that kind of, that's the atmosphere I find in a lot of these churches.
That's very true, Kevin, and it's actually almost like going into a court. It's a kind of slightly more low-level version of going into court, I find, which again is the Roman cult, and people basically getting taken over and possessed. Going back to sort of Canaan and the Baal worship, I mean, we're talking about who were the Canaanites? How did that? How do you think that tied in to what became the Roman cult, or do you think it did, or do you think they existed kind of simultaneously?
I think they existed simultaneously. This is something that's in the background of the human race for a while. It has to do with the domination of elites, and in that part of the world where you had the development for the first time of these elites, they could only control the majority through fear and terror, and that's part of the reason religion was invented. But a specific kind of religion that had domination over the law. I mean, the law and religion are really one and the same. They've always been. And when you say to go into the courts, courts are simply secularized churches, but they're the same mystique around judges wearing robes, having the power of life and death over people who they cannot be challenged. All of that, it's really from that cult, which is thousands of years old. And the spiritual angle is absolutely there's possession involved. I've seen this up close. I've been present at exorcisms. I've seen these entities. And I mean, not often physically, but you have that ability in your heart and your inner eye to see this stuff. And they're definitely at work. And so I think it's all of that. It isn't any just aspect.
It's a very fascinating area, this, because this whole thing of possession and what possession is, and how that crosses over into what's now termed as mental illness and schizophrenia. There is definitely an evil force at work on the planet. And reading the Nag Hammadi scriptures, it does look as though there's been some real manipulation of the human race. There's a few standout quotes that I use from that, basically about the manipulation through original sin, and how that's been used against us. And this whole idea is completely ludicrous, that we're somehow born imperfect,
I should send you the manuscript. I'm working on a new book which looks into exactly that. If you look at the Hebrew translation of Genesis and the creation story, it's a totally different story when you translate directly from the Hebrew. And it tells a whole story of the Elohim, this race of aliens, basically, who created a slave population called man. And the serpent was not a source of evil. In fact, the serpent was the means of liberating Adam and Eve from their ignorance.
Yes.
And eating from the tree of knowledge. I mean, like, for example, the Hebrew word for tree is not tree, it means door. It was a doorway into knowledge that the Elohim were trying to deny us. And when we defied them, they infilled us with shame and self-destruction and warring with one another. And that's part of the whole deeper story, kind of a codified story within the Bible that most people don't know about.
Because, the Hebrew translation is obviously different. Now, in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, there's a quote from the rulers of the world, Mold Adam. It says, 7 archons have formed humanity with a body resembling their own body, but the likeness of humankind reflects the human being who appeared to them. The modelled body came into being part by part from each of the rulers, and the leader of the rulers created the brain and marrow. So what we're talking about here is that we were created in their image, and there seems to be this kind of deeply kind of sinister undercurrent of control, which it comes out in several of the passages in the Nag Hammadi scriptures. Basically, it says the powers rape earthly Eve, because they see her and see she looks like Adam, and they rape her. So and this is the quote, so she may not ascend into her light, and her children will serve us. Now, this is quite scary stuff, I think.
Well, right. It's all about, of course, these Catholic schools, residential schools, they all did the same thing. You have to instill shame and self-destruction in people at a young age, in children. And then that causes the kind of society we have, where everyone is intimidated, have a knee-jerk reaction where we can't even raise our thought against authority. I mean, it's all coming from that system of spiritual traumatization.
Quite. What I find interesting about those Nag Hammadi scriptures is that a lot of it is the basic stuff of, okay, we're striving for perfection, we're trying to get there, and one day we might. That's basically the gist of it. It's like this search for perfection and divinity. But in amongst
That's
it, there's some really weird stuff that just sticks out. Um,
yeah.
on this on the origins of the world, the creation of humankind, it says on Adam, the authorities saw him in chaos. They laughed at the chief creator when he said, "I am God. No one exists before me." And it goes on, if you do not want him to be able to ruin our work, let us create a human out of the earth in the image of our body and with a likeness to this, being to serve us. Then he will fall in love with his likeness. Then he will no longer ruin our work, and we shall make the children of the light our slaves for this entire age. And in a way, that is the story of the Roman Church.
Very much. Yeah, that's almost an exact description of it. That's very good.
Yeah, I mean, I find this stuff astonishing, but it's this deviousness behind it all, which I find the most interesting and intriguing in the respect of we're talking about people or entities who are working on a very long calendar scale. And most of us don't do that. We think in terms of our short lives and think, oh well, most people think life's too short, can't do that. But there is an agenda going on here that that is definitely has been moving forward over quite a long period of time. Now, do you think that at the top of these organisations, especially the Vatican, and we can include the Knights of Malta in that, that at the top of these organisations there is actually a knowledge of an agenda that they are playing out? Or do you think they've lost control of their own system? What do you think of that?
I'm often, just based on what I see every day, I think that there is a big struggle going on at that level. It isn't a unitary elite, that there's factions within it, and they're at war right now. That's reflecting events in the world. But ultimately behind it, I think there is one entity. I think it exists by feeding off the innocence of the human race. I think it's literally feeding off us like we're cattle. And that's what we mean by spiritual warfare. It means taking back your sovereignty, your mind and soul first, because you can't wage the battle without doing that first.
That's my feelings as well. And I've been thinking about how best you get this over to people. And I think really it goes back to, we have to claim our rights, because we never claimed our rights. That papal bull, Unum Sanctum, of 1302,
Right.
states, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. Now, that's basically put us in trust to this so-called higher power. And we now know that they're a child sacrificing, murdering, thieving, land grabbing cult. So they've used their own power has been usurped by themselves, because they can no longer state that they have any divinity. So every human being can put in their own claim and say that they are true to conscience, and their conscience is universal, and they are the claim that they're making they do not hold any interest in, which may be fraudulent or vexatious, or to forward an agenda or biased interest. And I think there's something very interesting there, in the respect that we need to usurp the power that these people have assumed.
Well, it's that name Unum. It's like in the American slogan, "E pluribus unum," from any one.
Yeah.
That's the Roman thing imposed by the Jesuits on the American Constitution, when in fact nature says the opposite: from one, many. From one source, we are infinitely diverse and autonomous and sovereign, many different expressions of the one source, right? But they want to reverse that to capture us into the one corporate hegemony that came out of Rome originally. That's clear now.
Well, that's exactly right. And you see, the definition of property is anything that is owned by a person or entity,
Uh-huh.
and we are property of them under their assumption. But
Right.
removing that assumption
Yeah.
is actually not that
It,
difficult, and we've found this
yes.
by the way you deal with their system as it's breaking down. And I think this idea of individual sovereignty, but standing in real truth, and we've got a problem with this now because most people are conditioned to lie because the system makes them lie. They
Mhm.
have to lie. But if we stand in a universal truth or divinity, because property, if we're property, we come from the divine. All property comes from the divine. So even if we're property, we're still divine. So
Yeah.
their claim fails on both counts, basically.
And property doesn't mean an object. Property, in its definition, means a characteristic or trait, the property
Yes,
of something, right?
yes,
And we are characteristics, the trait of the divine source, not of any human owner. The Romans reduced everybody to chattels, just like the Roman Church does. But they only have that unum sanctum thing only applies if you consent either consciously or unconsciously, right?
that's
So
right. Yes,
once you claim that back, their power falls apart.
yeah. I think that's the most important thing about black magic, which is what this is. In black magic, you have to consent. There has to be a signature or an agreement in blood. There has to be some
Yeah.
kind of tacit agreement between the two parties. And that's where their contracts come from. That's why their system's falling apart. And basically, that's where you get them because it's all about an assumption. And if you remove the assumption and put truth in the way,
Yeah.
then I've found that it seems to work, and obviously you have.
It does work. And a simple example of that is under statute law, it's a given. They don't tell us this, but it's a given in their court system that if you don't agree with the statute, it has no authority over you. Any statute has only binding authority with the consent of those it's acting upon, right? We can withdraw their consent, and it doesn't matter what their law or statute say. It's the same spiritually.
That's exactly right. I had a very comedy version of that with the tax office today, trying to impose a fine, even though I took my tax return in goodwill to the tax office, which had been closed down. And I said I'd had no disclosure of that, so I'm now invoicing the Inland Revenue for 300 quid. But the
Oh,
point,
really?
yeah, but the point
Right.
is, that's a kind of light version of it, but it's actually the truth. It's like
Right.
they don't know how their own system works, and yes, it does work by consent. Now, this is the whole thing that we are treated as imbeciles, and through these statutes of law, we became more and more treated as we were chattel goods of the state, and
Yeah.
it went up as far as the middle of the 1800s when county courts were made admiralty, which meant they were administrative. So judges became administrators. So the divine power of the judge was removed. So the judge is merely there to follow administration. So we can direct the judge. It doesn't have to be the Roman cult or the corporate court that's directing the judge, even though obviously the corruption's off the charts. But it's our duty when we go into court to direct that judge and to make our claim.
Right, because their system works on implied consent.
Correct,
There's
yes.
an implied consent when all we have to do is stand up and say, "I withdraw my consent," whether real or implied. That's all you need to say.
That's right. And the other thing to say in court is when this stuff's going in is I object.
Yeah, I do not understand because you know all about standing under, understand all
That's
that.
right. Yeah, yeah. It's funny, Kevin, because there's more and more. I talk to a lot of young people, and a lot of them are getting this stuff. They haven't got quite the bigger picture, but they're doing really well on it. I talk to young guys around this area, and they said, "That's right. Don't do that. Don't do this," and they're picking it up quick. So maybe there is hope.
Definitely, there is hope. We see it all the time. It's growing.
Yeah. Well, I really thank you for your work, and thanks for that, because we've taken a little diversion away from the work of the ITCCS, but
Oh,
really
no,
this is the backbone of
it
the
really
whole
is.
thing, isn't it?
It sure is, Mark. And yeah, we'll get into it more in the future.
That's great, Kevin. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, and just reminding folks, itccs.org. Follow our work.
Thanks for joining us on Windows on the World. Remember, keep watching those, watching us, watching Windows on the World. We'll see you soon.